of the boiler explosion aboard the USS Bennington. We are here in memory of the 66 sailors and one officer who lost their lives on July 21st, 1905, here in San Diego Bay. I'd like to ask Reverend Dr. DeLong to do the invocation.
Let us bow our heads in prayer. Almighty and ever-living God, our Father, we pause before you to give you thanks for these men who answered the call of our nation over a century ago. Yet they were called home long before their time by an engineering casualty aboard the Bennington. You are ever vigilant in your watchful care over us. Please accept our gratitude for taking them to their eternal rest until they were united with their family and friends in heaven by your eternal love. May our tribute to them be truly fitting. Bless us all in your holy name, we ask it. Amen.
Color Guard and Boy Scouts, advance the colors. We'll now do the Pledge of Allegiance. So would everybody please face the flag of our nation, put your left hand over your heart and say with me, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Two. Will the Scouts present the wreath to Don Farnum and Graham White? Color Guard, retire the colors. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to take a moment to introduce some of our guests from afar. Please hold any applause until everybody has been introduced. Go ahead and have a seat. First is Don Farnum. Don is a great grandnephew of Admiral Caspar Goodrich. He's traveled from Riverhead, New York on Long Island to be with us here today. Thank you to Don's sister, Kathy Posenhofer, and her husband, Glenn. and their children Lillian and Owen. They drove down from Monterey to be present at this historic event. Unfortunately, Don's brother, Chris Farnum, from Watermill, New York, was unable to join with us, but he sends his regards and wishes for a great tribute to Admiral Goodrich. We have a former shipmate of Don's, Kevin Hurley, and his brother Brent from Edwards, New York. Don and Kevin were stationed together aboard the USS America CD-66. Ted and Jean Strong from Phoenix, Arizona. Ted's cousin was on the USS Bennington when it exploded. He was Charles Samuel Carter, but there's more to the story. So after the ceremony, please ask him. I'd like to introduce Patricia Dudley Gullert. Her father was a lighthouse keeper from 1930 till 1951. During World War II, there was a blackout on Point Loma. I'd like to introduce Mary Ellen Cortinelli and Karen Scanlon, authors and historians who together made this today's event happen. Graham Wright, Assistant Director, Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. Stephen Lawson, Ship Historian. Edward Schwann, honored guest. Thank you all for coming near and far to pay tribute to the fallen of the USS Bennington in 1905 and to commemorate the dedication of the Bennington Monument by Admiral Goodrich in 1908. I'd like to now go to the program and introduce Karen Scanlon, Bennington historian and author, for her presentation.
Hello everyone, how nice to have you here with us. All of us are here to remember the 1905 loss of and injuries to the sailors and one officer of the Navy gunboat USS Bennington. We also commemorate the efforts of Admiral Casper F. Goodrich, commanding officer of the Pacific Squadron, and Bennington officer Ensign Lindsay H. Lacey, that's a mouthful. Many of us here today, of course, have traveled great distances to participate in today's event. Others are committed locally to pay tribute to the Bennington disaster each July. Still others of us, and I'm going to cry. Sorry. Still others of us have taken this history as a life vocation. We can only imagine the chaos taking place in our harbor yesterday morning and still today. July 21, 1905. 2 boilers releasing their anger. Clouds of black steam rising over the city. A shuddering, hissing warship littered with her dead and dying. Horrified onlookers shaken into action, and mariners sweeping the bay. Witnesses to one of the deadliest peacetime disasters in the history of the United States Navy. The Army at Fort Rosecrans had been, the Army at Fort Rosecrans had been occupied only a few months. Construction Quartermaster Captain Robert H. Rolfe was headed across the bay on the government launch, the DeRussy, when a low rumbling roar caught his attention, and then 2 quick blasts. "It was the Navy's gunboat exploding before my very eyes," he later told a reporter. "The whole deck seemed to lift, and he immediately boarded the 1,700-ton steel wreck and began the rescue work. 2 days later, a convoy of wagons laboring under the weight of 47 coffins pressed north through the city and up the devious hill to the post cemetery here at Fort Rosecrans. Thousands of mourners and citizens joined in the somber march and made their own way across San Diego Bay. Bennington survivors and a significant military presence rendered a collective salute as the wagons bearing the dead approached the large burial trench. And that would have been right over here. This is the burial trench right here. Squads of 6 sailors stepped rapidly from the ranks and then slowly lifted the caskets one by one and carried them into the earth.
Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
I'd like to introduce Don Farnum. Don is a great grandnephew of Admiral Goodrich.
Good morning and hello San Diego. It's been nearly 40 years since I last lived here in America's finest city, and how I miss it so. Thank you for your warm welcome and the joy of your company today. Please allow me first to thank a few people for their hospitality and their invitation to be with you here. To Mary Ellen Cordellini, who reached out to me, and how excited I was that she did. Mary Ellen is on a wonderful journey as she works closely with other historians, keeping the memory alive of those lives lost to the Bennington tragedy. I'm confident that the heroes of the Bennington and their descendants today deeply appreciate her commitment. To Karen Scanlon, who warmly opened her heart and beautiful home to me, and for helping arrange accommodations for my shipmate, Kevin Hurley, and his brother Brent. Thank you so much, Karen. We deeply appreciate your thoughtfulness. I would like to thank the Director and Assistant Director of Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, Mr. Rex Kearns and Graham Wright, for their leadership in maintaining this sacred site. Please know, gentlemen, that I am honored to be affiliated with our nation's largest national cemetery, Calverton National Cemetery on Long Island. Working closely with the director there, Mr. Michael Paserno, I have seen with my own eyes and how reverent cemetery employees are at a national cemetery by how they treat our fallen comrades and their families bereft with grief. Thank you for hosting us today. To my fellow shipmate and friend Kevin Hurley and his brother Brent, who traveled far from upstate New York to be with us, thank you guys very much for being part of this incredible story. Lastly, to my brother Chris, who regrettably could not make the trip with me, but who first started me on the path of researching our family history. As Chris likes to say, I was the spark to Don's gasoline. And to our sister Kathy and her husband Glenn and children Lily and Owen, please, I thank you so much for making the trip down with me today and sharing the day. Ladies and gentlemen, I am the end of a long and distinguished Navy line. Like my brother before me who served in Vietnam War, our father in World War II, his father in World War I and World War II, and many uncles and cousins in between. We have all worn the uniform and served this great nation of ours. Out of this lineage, however, 2 notable family members stand out. Rear Admiral Caspar Frederick Goodrich, who was my great-granduncle. He graduated first in his class in 1864 at the United States Naval Academy. With the Civil War in full swing, the Academy officials felt they should move the midshipmen to Newport out of harm's way of the war. It was the only class in the United States naval history to have graduated outside of Annapolis, Maryland. Considered an academic, Admiral Goodrich was a professor at the Naval Academy teaching chemistry and physics, as well as being a published author. He was a founding member and twice president of the Naval War College in Newport. Among his colleagues are other notable admirals, Admirals Luce, Farragut, Mahan, Decatur, Dewey, etc. He was also the commandant of the Navy Yard in Brooklyn and served as the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, which was called Squadron in his day. Princeton University conferred upon him an honorary degree of Doctor of Science. He was a member of the Naval Order of the United States, and the Navy honored him and his son, Lieutenant Caspar Goodrich Jr., by naming the first Navy destroyer named after father and son, the USS Goodrich. Equally was his nephew, my cousin, Admiral Alan Goodrich Kirk. Also a graduate of the Naval Academy, he became a full admiral during World War II and was appointed the United States Naval Commander of Operation Overlord on D-Day, overseeing the invasion of Omaha and Normandy beaches, Omaha and Utah beaches at Normandy. He's also a colleague to other distinguished admirals and generals of his generation, namely Nimitz, Halsey, Spruance, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, to name a few. After his 55-year career in the Navy, he was appointed the United States Ambassador to Luxembourg, China, and the Soviet Union. And the Navy also honored him with the naming of a fast frigate, USS Kirk. One of those brave men who survived the Bennington disaster was Medal of Honor recipient Mr. John Henry Turpin, who reportedly also survived the explosion of the Maine in Havana Harbor, the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. It seems another family connection to the Bennington, in addition to the Admiral Goodrich, exists. My family also had a relative who lost his life on the Maine, Martin Toohey. He was a coal passer, and sadly was one of the 266 sailors who lost their life in that explosion. Ladies and gentlemen, Navy blue and gold run deeply in my family veins. This first article appeared in a local San Diego newspaper immediately following the explosion on board the Bennington in 1905, and was referenced in the book Needler, Prominent Army Officer and Beloved Coronado Physician. I think it illustrates so wonderfully how Admiral Goodrich cared for his Blue Jackets, and how his presence that day as their Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Squadron meant to them. The second article that I will read was of the speech given by the Admiral when he returned to San Diego in 1908 as the Commandant of the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. He helped dedicate this impressive monument next to me. Admiral Goodrich, together with his, it should be noted that only a few months prior to arriving in San Diego, Admiral Goodrich, together with his wife Eleanor, suffered a tragic death of their own with their son Lieutenant Casper Jr., an officer on board the USS Georgia, from a gun turret explosion. He and others suffered terribly or killed in much the same fashion as the heroic dead of the Bennington. Admiral Goodrich visited the various hospitals of the city where the wounded of the Bennington are still lying. He first went to the barracks and saw each wounded man personally, speaking to him a word of cheer. It was certainly a beautiful sight to see how the men's faces shone with pleasure at this courtesy shown to them by the commander of the squadron. The kindly manner and pleasant words of the Admiral won all the hearts of the men and cheered them more than anything that has happened since the explosion. After making the rounds, Admiral Goodrich said he desired to express to the medical men of the city his deep appreciation of the work they had so nobly done. And he said he would express this appreciation to President Roosevelt. He spoke as highly of the work done by the nurses. The next place visited was St. Joseph's Hospital, and every sick man here also received a personal visit. Those accompanying the Admiral on the trip were Captain Moore, Surgeon Smith, Captain Rolfe, Commander Young, and Major Needler, along with 3 lieutenants. It is not possible to grasp the full significance of the duty which calls us together without referring, even if briefly, to the time, the place, and the circumstance of an episode which, in some of its aspects, should never be forgotten. 2 years and a half ago, on a beautiful day, the United States ship Bennington, in the pink of condition, was laying in the stream off the principal wharf of San Diego, about to start for Panama on important foreign service. She had completed her provisions of coal and other supplies, had made all customary preparations, and as a last measure, was raising the steam necessary to carry her on her voyage. That accomplished, nothing would be left to do but weigh the anchor and proceed on the long journey to the southward. At 10 o'clock that eventful morning, there was nothing on land or sea or in the placid sky above that suggested in the remotest way what was impending. A few minutes later, a heavy explosion was heard, and the Bennington was immediately shrouded in a vast dark with soot and ashes. When it cleared away, the unlikely craft was observed to be settling in the water. leaning heavily to one side, and at the same time to have exchanged her spotless white for a full funeral gray, but too significant of the change in her personnel. One of her boilers had given way, through the failure of an important part, with consequences which we shudder to think of even now. The boiler itself was violently torn from its seat and projected several feet to the rear, breaking the connections with the other boilers, so that their contents, in turn, in the shape of steam and superheated water, were immediately released, killing and maiming wherever they penetrated and converting the forward half of the vessel into veritable shambles. The rupture of certain important pipes was followed, naturally, by the inrush of water into the ship, imperiling her safety and adding a new terror to an already frightful tragedy. When exerting themselves to the utmost to save the wounded, the uninjured had, at the same time, to keep the ship from foundering. That they performed these tasks quickly and well under such tremendous difficulties speaks in no uncertain tone for their discipline and ability. It is not my intention to narrate the many noble cases of self-sacrifice which illuminate the dark annals of that sad and dreary day. They have passed into history to form a splendid chapter of which all Americans may well be proud. They have passed out of the steam and clouds of the berth deck. Several found safety through the presence of mind, and one who, raising his voice above the din, called out, "This way, follow me." Men with scalded and blackened faces, the flesh dropping from their bones, endeavored to save their shipmates in still worse case. Some poor sufferers, crazed by pain, sought relief by throwing themselves into the sea. The instances of men returning again and again at the risk of their lives to rescue their wounded fellows from steam-filled and perilous spaces below are numerous enough to quicken our faith in mankind and to assure us that the American man-of-warsman of today worthily maintains the traditions of a glorious past. What more can be said of the fortitude of any man than this? Ferguson refused to aid and clambered into the ambulance himself, leaving large pieces of his skin on the dock. Alas, it is the only memory which we now can honor, for the man himself shortly afterwards crossed the great divide into the land where sin and suffering may not enter. One of those who succumbed eventually to their injuries, a number had expended their last remnant of vital energy in heroic efforts to help others who seemed to be still more helpless than they were themselves. Are not these with us in spirit today, adding their silent benediction to our service of respect and affection? The Bennington was beached by means of a towboat, fortunately hard by and with steam up, so that drowning, except in one case, was not added to scalding as the cause of death. In the meantime, that something appalling had occurred was learned by those even beyond sight of hearing the ship, for the news of the serious disaster was at once reported by telephone to San Diego's resourceful mayor and to the others in the city. Immediately after the explosion, shore boats of every description gathered about the ship. The behavior of the men in these small craft was particularly commendable. They approached the vessel without hesitation, regardless of the rumor that the magazines were likely to explode at any moment, as they remained in that vicinity as long as they could out of service, saving wounded sailors from the water, receiving others from the ship, and transporting them ashore. Some of them left their boats and boarded the vessel with a view to assist in the rescue from the lower decks of members of the crew who were unable to escape on account of their injuries and were in imminent danger of drowning in the water entering the ship. Where so many different things happened, all practically at the same time, it is impossible to give a consecutive narrative, and it is equally impossible to withhold admiration for the sagacity which is, in the main, was displayed by those whom the awful nature of the catastrophe moved to sympathetic activity. Nor was helpless prompt than it was effective. Before people in the city could drive in carriages to the scene, the killed and wounded were already being landed. That assistance, immediate and abundant, was sorely needed. The list of casualties proves conclusively. Some 40-odd men were killed outright. while within the next 2 days the death roll had mounted to 60, with wounded by the score. Eventually, 66 officers and men, 1/3 of the entire ship's company, lost their lives through the explosion. It is my privilege, as is my duty, to bear witness to the courage and fortitude of those who fought the losing fight against the archenemy, death. Never a word of complaint, never a whimper of whine did I hear as I visited them in the hospitals day after day, and prayed that their lives might be spared because of the heroism and patriotism which glorified their last hours. How the physicians of the city and the nurses, trained and volunteer, rushed to the aid of the stricken. How the mayor organized measures of relief. How every door was thrown open to the sufferers, and the ingenuity of tender hearts exercised to comfort and to cheer. How thoughtful Samaritans received the last messages of the dying and transmitted them to friends and family. How vehicles of all kinds, from the humble grocery wagon to the costly automobile, were placed at the attending surgeons to convey the wounded to the hospitals. How the Army extended the brotherly hand to the Navy and did more than the brother's part, assisting in its own splendid and efficient way. How the women of San Diego wrote letters for the helpless and lulled their pains with soft strains of music, vocal and instrumental. How one lady who needs no naming, so great have been her services to humanity, sent her representatives to read aloud to the men in their cots and brighten their rooms with flowers. How, later on, she sent carriages and tally-hoes to the convalescent that they might drive about in the fresh air. How she caused the enclosure of this cemetery to be draped with palm fronds on the day when the first victims of the disaster were laid to rest. How certain hotels, without charge, and substantially every home in San Diego welcomed the relatives of the unfortunate. How the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe Railway companies agreed, free of expense, to transport to any point on their lines the wives and mothers who had come to the bedsides of their dear ones. How the whole of San Diego shared in the solemn ceremonial which terminated the Bennington stay in this port, and how all that could be so repaired to this eminence to join in the prayers that were uttered, and to lay a tribute of flowers on the graves where so many gallant men are now sleeping their last peaceful sleep. All these things have passed into the annals of a community whose name deserves to be written in letters of gold for its prompt and practical expression of a sympathy without limit and without qualification. So long as there is a Navy of the United States, the memory of these ministrations will be fresh and green in the hearts of all who go down to the sea in their ships. There is no more fitting moment than the present to speak of the timely, efficacious, and generous assistance rendered by the representatives of the Army in San Diego. Had we been the same service, they could have done no more. From the very first, they were at hand, aiding in every possible way. Their extensive and carefully thought-out resources were placed unreservedly at our disposal. They helped in caring for the wounded, and they offered the dead the asylum of their own burying ground. They have acted for the Navy during the erection of the shaft, and have watched, with the jealous eye of a friend, the progress of the work from the turning of the first sod to the setting of the peridium. What could we have done without their trained supervision and their cordial cooperation? That this monument is what it is and what it was intended to be is largely due to the fact that close by were those who held our project as sacred as it had been their own. The marking of this particular plot in a manner worthy of what it contains is the outcome of the interests and labor of a body of gentlemen, principally, if not wholly, citizens of San Diego, who felt with justice that cenotaph would fail to voice adequately the sentiment of its builders, if everything about it were not in harmonious completeness. Having already done much for the living, and especially for those bereft by the accident, by whom its name will ever be held in blessed remembrance, the Bennington Memorial Association, with rare grace and discrimination, has rounded out its term of loving activity by providing the appropriate coping which now encloses this hallowed ground. I am commanded by the Secretary of the Navy, himself a Californian, to state that the Navy, through him, wishes to be recorded as deeply grateful for these proofs of sympathy preferred, one by a sister service in which many of these vicissitudes the Navy has shared and whose achievements it delights to applaud, the other by a band of citizens to whom it is drawn in fellowship through great catastrophe, linking us together in the hands of a common brotherhood. And the Secretary of the Navy further profits by this opportunity to renew the Navy's expression of thankful appreciation of the thousands and one acts of kindness that which surround the days of the tragedy itself with imperishable halo. Some among my bearers, doubtless with me on this spot the last time I had come to visit it, when we bade goodbye to those who, called from our midst, had found on this hillside their last earthly abode, will recall the profound sentiments which the affecting scene and its regrettable cause inspired. They were not, I am sure, surprised by later intelligence that the comrades of those who here buried had determined that such an example should not go unhonored. As the funeral procession wound its way down to the shore to embark on board the Chicago and Bennington, this determination took first shape as a pious hope. As the Chicago steamed out to sea that evening with the Bennington in tow, their prows turned toward the north, the ships themselves disappeared in the golden haze of a calm and beautiful California sunset. That hope became a desire. When the vessels composing the Pacific Squadron assembled, this desire was found to be substantially universal in the fleet. Steps were taken to give it practical form, and a fund for the purpose was speedily raised by the officers and men, the subscribers forming themselves into the Bennington Monument Association. Many contributions, some of them quite large, were offered by outsiders, but all were declined. That it was our own tribute to our own comrades, we held with a jealousy which can only be understood by those who have themselves been called upon to make the greater sacrifice. The finished obelisk stands here today. It makes no pretense to elaboration of design or ornamentation, for it merely commemorates the heroism of simple men whose sole guiding purpose was devotion to duty. To all, it announces that he who enters the naval service of the United States does so unreservedly, in fact, as well in the word. At any moment and in a manner, he may be called upon to fill that obligation to the letter. His life is one of perils and privations. Long years are devoted by him in preparation for one brief hour, upon whose issue may hang the very existence of the nation. The annals of our Navy but too dolorously proclaim that this preparation has exacted and continues to exact its heart-rending toll of human life. Yet some must perish that this nation may survive. The end of those who repose here was not less exalted in its patriotism than in the end of those who fought in battle. In some respects, it seems to be on a still higher plane. For them were denied the laurels of the victor and the shouts of an applauding populace. Yet as they look down upon this scene today from the heights of the Beatitude, they must rejoice in the consciousness that they failed not to give to their country when she asked it, the utmost they had to give, dying as brave men and true would wish to die in the performance of duty. Nothing we can do will add to their fame, yet knowing this full well, we, their comrades here, declare that, as far as our poor efforts can accomplish it, the lesson of this great sacrifice shall not be lost to their native land. In this spirit, we dedicate this monument to the memory in token of our own affection and of the reverence in which the Navy holds its illustrious dead. As the Admiral ceased, pardon me please, I think I would like to leave you with this ending thought from the Admiral. Brothers, you have but gone before us into eternal rest, through the grim portal of suffering and pain. But you have left us, who linger, the lamp of your example to shine so long as our Navy shall exist, cherishing its living and mourning those who fell at their post. From this sacred spot, the youth of our broad country who enters its service will draw fresh inspiration, living will they be cared for and helped along their way. And when the last summons shall come, find a eulogy they cannot receive, that they have met their fate as bravely, as loyally, and as unregrettably as did the dead of the United States ship Bennington. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Graham Wright, who will be reading the letter by Admiral Goodrich.
First of all, as the Assistant Director for Fort Rosecrans and Miramar National Cemeteries, I'd like to welcome each of you out here today for this memorial for the USS Bennington. I get the great fortune of maintaining this, and it is a good fortune. When I wake up each morning, I have the luxury of being able to live here on the station, and it's just awe-inspiring that I actually get to do this. Sometimes I have to pinch myself in unbelief because of the honor that I have to have been selected for what I feel is a lofty and a wonderful job that I get to do. It's interesting, and I'm very grateful to Mary Ellen Corlini and Miss Scanlon for the work that you guys have put into this. Often over time, as it goes from director to director, a lot gets lost. And certainly for a cemetery this old, much has been lost over time, but because of these efforts, it gets brought back to life, and we understand a little bit more about what happened. When I got here a year ago, I looked at this wonderful site, and I said, oh, how wonderful this is, how beautiful it is. And then I started researching, and I realized that they brought 47 sailors here. There's 35 stones. They're all nice and in a row. And then I realized through the research and looking at the old records that some of those people were disinterred, and they were taken back to their homes. So what ends up happening is that just out of basic knowledge of how this would happen, you would have spots that would just be blank, but yet there are no blanks here except for the one in the middle there. And I was like, oh, how wonderful. Somebody decided to rewrite history. And they decided to lift these stones up and put them all nice and straight and make them look wonderful. But, that's the history of the cemetery also. And that's what happens. But because of your efforts, and looking at this book today, I actually now see the map that is at the National Archives that I didn't realize existed because it had been taken away from the cemetery, that showed how this plot was laid out and how the people were buried here. And I just think that's wonderful to be able to have that available now and to be able to see that and understand a little bit more about the history that actually gave life to this national cemetery. I'd like to read now the letter from Admiral C.F. Goodrich, Rear Admiral, United States Navy, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Squadron. This is to the Secretary of Navy, Department of the Navy, Washington, D.C. It says, Sir, I have the honor to recommend that the burial ground in which are interred the remains of the men who lost their lives in the Bennington disaster be set apart as a national military cemetery. This plot, 149 feet square, is located on Point Loma, a short distance to the westward of Fort Rosecrans and on the same military reservation. It is at an elevation of about 450 feet above sea level, and it commands a beautiful and impressive view of the bay and the city of San Diego and of the surrounding country. It has been used for many years for the burial of the service dead in that vicinity and at this date. In addition to those from the Bennington, contains the remains of 78 men who lost their lives in the government service. Among this number are included 16 soldiers of General J.C. Fremont, killed at the Battle of San Pasqual, 2 officers of the United States Dragoons, and officers and men of all branches of the present organization of the Army. Many of these bodies have been removed to this spot from isolated and neglected graves in the vicinity of San Diego, only those of latter date having been placed there directly on decease. The burial ground receives only such attention as can be provided by working parties from the post garrison, no regular provision being made for its upkeep. It is enclosed by a plain wooden fence. The soil is drifting sand. And the general aspect of the place, despite its unexcelled position, is desolate and melancholy in the extreme. If this small area were constituted a national military cemetery, it could readily, at small expense, be converted into a fit resting place for the most honored dead. A sufficient sum for this purpose would then be available from the yearly appropriation for the establishment and maintenance of such cemeteries, an appropriation dispersed by the Secretary of War. No expenditure would be required for the purchase of the property, as it is located on a government reservation. The only initial expense would be as to provide by statute for the erection of a permanent stone or iron fence and of a porter's lodge, the placing of the headstone at each grave, and in addition, the installation of the necessary pipes from the ample water supply already available close by, to provide for the ultimate covering of the plot with sod. The outlay, with subsequent constant attention of a superintendent employed as provided by the statute in the case of national military cemeteries, would ensure perpetual evidence that the dead interred at this spot are included among those whom the nation honors. I am informed by the commanding officer of Fort Rosecrans that it is his intention to make recommendations similar to the foregoing to the Secretary of War. Feeling as I do so strongly about the matter, I venture to ask the Department's favorable consideration of this suggestion. Signed, very respectfully, C.F. Goodrich, Rear Admiral, United States Navy, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Squadron.
Steve Lawson. Steve Lawson. Ship historian.
Thank you.
In 1905, the Navy was challenged in finding sailors and the officers to lead them. But those officers on the Bennington, their hard work and character made up for their small number. Today I wish to pay tribute to the young ensigns, all recent graduates of the United States Naval Academy, who were both victims and heroes during the Bennington disaster. Of the 4 ensigns on board that fateful day, July 21st, 1905, Newman Perry was immediately incapacitated and later died from his injuries. But the other 3 were noted for their selfless acts of heroism and for assisting the rescue of their fellow shipmates. The 3 duty officers exhibited the same bravery as many of the enlisted sailors. However, although 11 Blue Jackets received the Medal of Honor, back in 1905, naval officers were ineligible for the medal. When we look at the documents and correspondence following the historic tragedy, we find testament of the bravery demonstrated by these young men. Ensign Leo Sam was injured when he joined Chief Gunner's mate John Clossy in flooding the forward magazine to prevent ammunition from potentially exploding. Commander Young wrote of Ensign Charles T. Wade, Chief Engineer, quote, "At a time was absolutely dangerous to his life, rushed down to the engine room and remained there assisting the wounded and dying between decks until forced on deck by the water, and as a result is suffering so from the effects that he should not be ordered to duty again for a long time," unquote. The most flattering commendation was written by the Secretary of the Navy about Lindsay Hensley Lasley as follows. Navy Department, Washington, October 30th, 1905. Sir, the Department takes much pleasure in enclosing herewith copies of letters from Rear Admiral Casper F. Goodrich, U.S. Navy, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Squadron, Commander Lucian Young, U.S. Navy, commanding the USS Bennington, and Lieutenant Alexander F. H. Yates, U.S. Navy, Executive Officer of the USS Bennington, dated respectfully October 16th, August 1st, and August 4th, 1905, calling the Department's attention to your conduct on the occasion of the blowing up of one of the boilers on the Bennington on July 21st, 1905, which is commended by these officers in the very highest terms. It is gratifying the department to receive letters of this character regarding an officer in the Navy, which strengthens the confidence of the department and the country at large has in the abilities and resources of the officers of the Navy. Copies of the letters above referred to, together with a copy of this letter, have been made a part of your record in the department. Very respectfully, Charles J. Bonaparte, Secretary. Despite the horrific event the ensigns endured during the loss of the fellow officer, all three remained for the Navy for many years, ascending through its ranks. Charles Wade, Lindsay Lacey both attained the rank of lieutenant commander, and after retiring from the Navy, Lacey obtained a PhD. The third ensign, Leo Sam, rose to the rank of Navy captain. The dedication of the young man to the Navy is a testament to the character, bravery, love, and loyalty to our country. Thank you.
Edward Schwan.
Important words. Music also can transcend and speak directly to our heart. Mary Ellen was able to find some music that was written specifically for this event in San Diego at that time and sent it to me, and then I carefully typed it into the computer, recorded it, and I wanted to share it, at least a little bit of it, with you, because music not only speaks to our heart, but can also transport us back in time. And when you hear this music, I think it will give you imagery and thoughts right back where all this happened. As we fight with technology. I'm going to play a first stanza by itself so you can get a feel for the music, and then I'm going to read some of the lyrics that were written specifically for this event and this piece of music. Praise for the hero who falls in the strife, with his face turned full to the foe. Honor, no less, to these brave boys in blue who suffered but could not go. What lessons of courage and patience we learned as we stood at their bed. And 3 times 3 for these lads of the sea, the living as well as the dead. Lay them away on the sun-kissed hill, with the sea sobbing low at their feet. Lay them away till the last great day, when shipmate and chum shall meet, where the sentence left unfinished, and the laugh that was turned into prayer, the plans that were made, the hopes that were laid, shall all be completed up there.
On your program, there are, at the bottom, there are 3 short paragraphs. I'd like to read them. Mary Ellen Cortinelli, historian and author, organized today's Bennington Commemorative. Thank you for the assistance of the SAR, Sons of the American Revolution, compatriot Philip Henshaw, Steve Lawson, Terry Norwood, Karen Scanlon, and the staff of Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. Our appreciation to Sean Bosley for filming today's ceremony for members of the USS Goodrich Association. SAR Color Guard, compatriots Stanley DeLong, Robert Hayden, Philip Henshaw, and Richard Palmer. Today we remember the crew of Indian 617, the helicopter, Anti-Submarine Squadron 6, lost in the waters off San Diego on 19 May 2009. I'd also like you to remember Warrant Officer Michael Hall, my nephew, whose Black Hawk helicopter was shot down. All aboard died in a tragic 1994 friendly fire accident in Iraq. Ed, do you have any? I'd like to have the benediction by Reverend Dr. DeLong.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace, now and forevermore. Until we meet again, may the sun fall to your back, the flowing seas behind you, and the Lord bless and keep you until then. Amen.
Well, thank you all for attending. This concludes our ceremony. I want to let everybody know that your attendance here today has meaning. Thank you for arriving. Bye-bye.